Thank you so much for that intro. I'm happy to be speaking to you here all today about finding and evaluating generic market entry opportunities. So just as a background, this talk comes from about just over a decade, 18 years experience helping generic companies and others in the space figure out what strategies and what decisions they can be making around such things, such market changing things as generic entry, patent expiration, litigation, other things like that. So the basic outcomes here, this talk is focused on a generic audience, generic industry audience, is to help figure out some strategies around finding and evaluating generic entry opportunities, to also help learn such things as litigation-free generic launch strategies, because a lot of smaller generic firms prefer to avoid litigation and just find right-sized opportunities, and also things like leveraging 505(b)(2) approvals and branded generics. And finally, another note on just how you can learn from litigation, so that even if you're not involved in litigation, you can still learn from litigation of others about what's going on in the industry. So it's probably no surprise to anyone here that, of course, as more generics enter the market, prices go down. So that's obviously great for consumers. The challenge from a generic and a branded company perspective, of course, is how to maintain profitability despite these changes. So as you see from this chart, it's a dated chart from the FDA, but the trend certainly still holds true, even if the numbers are no longer precise, they're still directionally accurate, is that as more generics enter the market, prices go down. So with a single generic entrant, prices don't go down very much. And as more generics enter the market, you get better competition. And this means that there's a stratified opportunity space for generics based on where you want to be. For generics with the resources and the desire to go after patents, if they can bust patents, they can be the first generic in and enjoy the spoils of that. And other companies would prefer to enter later, not having to deal with the expense and burden of litigation, and try to find where the right-sized opportunities are, and I'll be going over those. The other thing to think about here is that with generic entry, not only, of course, are drugs becoming less expensive, but also the volume of drug being produced will increase with patent expiration. So it's important to also look up your supply chain as time goes on, because more and more companies may be coming online to supply you with API or what have you. So as prices decrease, the cost may also decrease. And so the profitability doesn't necessarily have to be impacted by the fact that there's more competition. So there's a fantastic paper that's published 20 years ago by Fiona Scott Morton at Yale. I asked her a while ago to update this paper, or if there were any updates on this paper, and she said no, it's basically the same story. She was tracking which factors influenced generic entry decisions. She did an observational study. She was looking at which companies with which sorts of characteristics were entering and how they're making the decisions. So the ingredient obviously has a substantial impact on generic entry. If it's an expensive or difficult to source ingredient, it's going to attract fewer generic entrants. And for a generic company looking to expand their portfolio, if they know their sources to get that ingredient or an ingredient which can be used for multiple sorts of drugs, they're obviously going to want to enter markets where they already have the ingredient sourced and they have trusted suppliers in place and they know what the compound properties are. So they're not going to have any downstream issues getting their ANDA approved. Likewise, recipe and testing, there's less work to be done. Companies with greater familiarity will prefer those sorts of opportunities. Capital plays in as well. This comes right back to things like litigation, where if it's going to be expensive to enter a market because you have to face litigation and you may have to litigate multiple patents before you find one that you can bust, it's going to be reserved for larger companies. And distribution channels, of course, play into this as well. So we saw on the slide, a couple of slides back, how the first generic entrant can enjoy much higher prices than the other later entrants, but they can also enjoy greater market share over second and further entrants. And this comes from another study. I can't remember the school, but it's cited down at the bottom of your screen. And what they found is that the first generic entrant can lock in with suppliers. So suppliers, by the time that more generic entrants come on the market, they know and trust the first entrant, and a small difference in price may not be enough to shake them off because they know the quality of the product. They've already got the supply chains lined up. Were they to switch suppliers, they have to deal with inventorying 2 drugs at the same time and having to deal with work running down one inventory, switching to the new one. And so it's something to think about. If you are going to be a later generic entrant, you can't just show up with a better price. You also have to think about what the constraints are for the downstream customers, and how else can you make their life easier. So when you're looking at generic entry categories, I mentioned earlier on that one of the things is familiarity with the space and distribution channels. It's also important to take a look at the profitability of a drug. So in addition to simply taking a look at the numbers of units sold or the sales volume for a drug, what is the trend for that drug? So for a drug like Premarin, estrogen replacement therapies or their hormone replacements are losing favor. So you see that it's been a downward trend with time. And so entry into this category would be unattractive. Lantus, on the other hand, is growing in sales, and so that would represent a good opportunity. And so these are the sorts of things to look at, not just the units sold and the revenues, but also the direction of the trend. Another thing to look at when you're looking to not be the first generic entrant, but when there's already others on the market, is what the price difference is between the branded and the generics in a space. So presumably when there's a very large price difference between the brand and the generics, that would imply that the generics have already fought the price all the way down. And unless you have a compelling reason why you can undercut everyone else in the market, you may want to stay away from these drugs where there's a very large generic versus brand difference. So aside from the price, aside from how profitable the brand is, what are the prices that other generics are able to enter the market at? Is it a race to the bottom? Is there too much competition? Or if there's a smaller difference between branded and generic prices, either it's going to be an expensive drug to produce, so no one else has been able to enter, or perhaps there's just not enough generic entrants and you'll be able to find yourself some fertile ground there. Looking further, getting more granular on pricing, it's also important to take a look at the sales channels. So for example, for a drug like sildenafil, when people purchase sildenafil, they primarily purchase it, you see here on the chart on the left, through either mail order or a pharmacy inside a store, also from drugstores, but they're predominantly buying Viagra, not sildenafil, through those channels. Sildenafil is preferred, it's a generic version of Viagra, is preferred when it's being sold through, as you see on the right-hand chart in the orange, through an HMO, clinic, or a hospital, someone who has a formulary that's going to force switching to sildenafil over Viagra. So for drugs like Nexium as well, where there's very strong branding on those drugs, as a generic entrant, you have to think about which channels align with consumer behaviors, because if consumers are going to prefer the branded drug, then it's going to be harder to sell generics. And if you can focus on the channels where generics are preferred, you're going to find better penetration. The other thing to think about here is 505(b)(2) opportunities. And broadly speaking, there's 3 categories of drugs. There's new drugs. This is most of the branded drugs you've ever seen. They're approved through the NDA, new drug application, or 505(b)(1) process, where all the reports, all the investigations are done by the applicant or the contractor for the applicant, but they're all controlled by the company that's applying for the drug application. So that's your traditional drug application. Generic drug applications, abbreviated new drug applications, are filed under what's called the 505J pathway. And that's where you cannot do any clinical trials. You cannot change anything about the drug. All you're trying to prove when you get your generic drug approved is that the generic drug is equivalent to the branded drug. The third category I show here on the far right, the hybrid category, 505(b)(2), and it's really just best described as 505(b)(2). Some people call it super generics or hybrid drugs or what have you. It's really just the best way to describe it is by what it is, a 505(b)(2). It can modify a drug, so it will have clinical trials to prove that the modifications are safe and effective, but it also leverages some clinical trials which are not done by the sponsor. So for example, if you take an orally dosed drug and want to make it available as injection or as a patch or something like that, you leverage the branded firm's clinical trials, just like you might for a generic drug, but you also do your own clinical trials to say the modifications you've made are still safe and effective. So it's a hybrid between a generic and a new drug application. the utility for generic entrants is that you can differentiate your drug from others. So perhaps you can end up, perhaps you can produce rather a drug with a longer lifespan, a longer half-life in the blood. You pegylate it, you do something else to it so it lasts longer. You end up with an extended release formulation. You can outcompete both the branded drug and all the generics because your drug is better. Maybe you can work around patents, change the manufacturing methods. It's another thing which can be done by 505(b)(2). So there's a lot of opportunities to think about here, and they're not necessarily, well, they're certainly not as expensive as a new drug application. So for generic companies who want to find opportunities to differentiate themselves from everyone else on the market, looking into 505(b)(2)s and finding these small changes you can make can be very profitable. And so this is just a study cited down at the bottom that shows what the most common 505(b)(2) applications changed. Often is changing a formulation or a manufacturer. So that may be a way to work around a patent. New dosage form, it's great opportunities. Take any orally dosed drug, and if you think that the target population may have problems or dislike orally dosed drugs, provide us a patch or something else. So that's it's a great way to differentiate. And also finding combinations of drugs, which may or may not be patentable depending on the exact nature of that combination and if it yields unexpected results. Another area for generics to look at is authorized generics. And an authorized generic is basically, it's a US specific phenomenon. It's a generic drug which is actually comes off the same supply line as the branded drug, but it's launched while another party has generic market exclusivity. So to back up a step, if a would-be generic entrant challenges a patent and successfully defeats that patent, they get 6 months of generic market exclusivity. What the brand may elect to do is launch a authorized generic using a partner so that there's 2 generics on the market. And the reason why they can do that is because they can go around the FDA regulations because they already have marketing approval, regardless of what label they put on the drug, whether it's their name or a generic label. They can effectively launch a second generic on the market to provide competition for the generic entrant with the 6 months of exclusivity. So this can be a fantastic way for generic companies to build affinity with brands if they have expertise in helping that brand best navigate erosion of sales when that other patent challenging generic enters the market. So just summarizing here what we've gone over, we're about to touch on branded generics, which is the column towards the left, but we've gone over the authorized generics, the traditional generics. Another opportunity for brands with for companies with strong brand recognition is what's called a branded generic. And these are basically drugs which don't have to have a brand name on them. They could be sold as generics, but for specific reasons, a company will put the brand on them. And the example I bring here is Abbott, which these are gummy bears, vitamins being sold. I can't remember the country. I believe this might be Ukraine, looking at the language. So in some countries, consumers do not trust the supply chain. So if it's a company they've never heard of versus Abbott, which is a globally trusted brand, they would rather buy their vitamin gummy bears for their kids from a brand they know and trust. So if a generic company has a strong brand, you may want to look into branded generic strategies as a way to differentiate, once again, from everything else on the market and get preferential sales. So I'm going to talk very briefly here about patent claim types. My objective here is not to educate you on how to challenge a patent as much as it is to understand that there are different types of patent claims, so that as a company not wishing to engage in litigation, or perhaps wishing to engage in litigation, it's useful just to know that there are multiple kinds of patents. And so just because there may be a number of patents on a drug, it doesn't mean that you have to wait till the last one expires. You might be able to launch earlier. So broadly speaking, there's compound claims there may be compound claims on a drug. Any drug may have one or more of these types of patents, or none of these claims in their patents. But if there are compound claims, tends to be you cannot work around that. So for a drug like Lipitor, there probably was a patent claiming the atorvastatin compound, the synthesis of that compound. It's virtually impossible to launch any generic version of atorvastatin without infringing on those claims. So compound claims tend to be the strongest sorts of claims you can have on a drug. Till the compound patents expire, there's nothing you can do. there might be process claims. So maybe it's a hard way to make a drug. I mentioned Premarin earlier. Premarin was actually sold for years without any patents on it because the process was kept as a trade secret, similar to Coke. It's a secret formula. No one was able to duplicate it. So if there's process claims on a drug, you may be able to work around those. You may need to do a 505(b)(2) application for the changes in the manufacturing process, but it may be able to work around that. Likewise with formulation and dosage claims. So for certain drugs, the EpiPen, for example, epinephrine was off patent for years, but the EpiPen, the auto-injector of the pen, was actually where the patents were. So it wasn't until someone figured out a way to make their own version of an auto-injector, which didn't infringe on Mylan's and patents for the EpiPen auto-injector, that a generic auto-injectable epinephrine was available on the market. So once again, these claims may be able to be worked around. You should always talk to an attorney, but it's something else to think about. As long as they're not compound claims, there's a decent chance that that you may be able to formulate a strategy. And finally, there's use claims. So if you take a drug, for example, Lipitor for reducing cholesterol, if a drug has multiple uses and only some of those uses have patents on them, as long as you can formulate and manufacture the drug, you may be able to sell it off-label for a different use, an unpatented use, and hope to get off-label sales into that patented use. You can't advocate for that use because that would be effective infringement. But even if you can't hope for off-label sales, just knowing that a drug serves multiple markets, a company may just want to focus on trying to sell it into the space where there are not use claims and enjoy that space. And once the patent on the patented use claims opens up, you already have the supply chain in place and you can just expand your sales. So it can be an interesting way to enter the market a little bit early with limited sales, knowing that as soon as the use claims expire, you'll be able to enjoy greater sales. So here's a handy little waterfall chart to show you how you might be able to look through this. When a drug has multiple patents, you might have, some drugs have a dozen or so patents on them. It's worthwhile looking at, in order, extended patents first. Certain patents can be extended by the brand for time spent in clinical trials or waiting for regulatory approval. So if a company elects to extend a certain patent and not extend other patents they have, that's basically a market-based indicator that the brand believes that that is a strong patent. So if you were to blindly guess at which patents are important, the extended patents are a good place to start. Another place to look at is litigated patents. So in this case, you have would-be generic entrants challenging patents. They're unlikely to waste their money challenging patents that don't matter. So if a patent is litigated, you could surmise that it's probably an important patent. And of all the patents that may be on a drug, those are also patents that you should wait for to expire before you try to launch a generic or investigate, put on your stack ranked list. Likewise, compound claiming patents, like I mentioned, just look for the word compound in the claims. It's a quick and dirty way. It's certainly not the best way, but it's a very quick and dirty way to separate your patents out and see which ones you think will or will not control generic entry. And if there are no other patents, no extended patents, no litigated patents, no compound claiming patents on a drug, and there's still no generics, chances are it's just you could just eyeball it by saying the next unexpired patent may or may not be the one which controls generic entry. So that's a quick and dirty way to try to pipeline draw out your pipeline without hiring an attorney and get a sense for when you may want to start thinking about advancing that program and looking into all the other factors involved in launching that drug. Certainly do not launch without talking to an attorney. You can get into a fair bit of trouble, but this is a way to help stack rank before you start talking to an attorney. So some other categories, these came up in the last few years, simply from client requests, is looking at patents with, for example, no competition, sorry, not patents, looking for drugs which have no patents and no competition. There's a fair number of these. And there's a variety of reasons one might posit for why it is that a drug has no patents and no competition. Maybe it's very hard to manufacture. Maybe it's a small market size. Maybe the supply chain constraints which make it really hard to enter that market. But nonetheless, if you don't want to get involved in litigation, and especially if you're looking for small opportunities just to either fill gaps in your pipeline or to get onto the market, looking for low competition drugs, either with no patents or perhaps even drugs which are discontinued and reviving them when they have no patents and one or a few sources. It's a great place to get a start without spending too much on legal fees or figuring out what to do about patents. Another space, I mentioned how once more than one company enters the market, prices drop quite a bit. And I also mentioned how the first generic entrant that can challenge and invalidate a patent gets 6 months of generic exclusivity. So what a lot of people do is if they don't want to get involved in looking at all the patents and trying to figure out which patent is dominant and when generics may enter, it's just taking a look at drugs which have 6 months of market exclusivity for having busted a patent. So which generics have earned 6 months of exclusivity, and you know on day 181, it's going to be open space. So for generics, you can simply take a look at all those drugs with 6 months of generic exclusivity and say, I'll launch on day 181. Same likewise for payers who want to know when prices are going to drop. The first generic entrant tends not to drop the price very much, so they look to day 181, and at that point they know, historically speaking, that more generics are likely to enter the market. So that's when they actually anticipate prices will drop, not the first generic entrant, but when the generic market opens up. And so finally, one more slide here, the DESI drugs, unapproved drugs. These are drugs which were grandfathered in from the Food and Drug Amendment Act, and they're still in the market. The FDA has said that they don't want to pull them off the market because some people need these drugs. However, if a company were to gain approval, formal approval for one of these drugs, which may not be that expensive because you do have safety data from the drug being on the market. So if a company were to gain formal approval for one of these drugs, only at that point would the FDA actually take action against the company who's selling it grandfathered in. So effectively, it's an unapproved drug. So you would get effectively temporary market exclusivity if you enter and the FDA were to knock out your competitor. So it's another area to look. At one point, there's 3,600 drugs on this list, and some of them are mundane, but some of them may represent good opportunities. So closing, I just want to go over how you can gain intelligence from patent litigation without actually having to get involved with litigation yourself. And this is a case I dug up. It's a secondary litigation. So there had been a patent dispute, and I'll just walk through this. Got to tiptoe a little bit carefully here. It was a contractual dispute secondary to a patent challenge, and in that contractual dispute, the terms of the agreements around the patents on the drug were revealed. So it was asserted that there was a breach of contract because Taikoku, who challenged Watson in this case for what they felt was patent infringement, felt that their agreement with Endo said that Endo was supposed to pay them for all their expenses. You can take a look at the case as well. I'm just going to comment on the results of the case, not the merits of the case. But what you can gain from this is taking a look. Taikoku said that they incurred expenses, and including attorney fees of $2.4 million, asserting their patents against Watson, who they felt was infringing on their patents. So if you were to be in a dispute with a company like Taikoku over a patent, you might imagine that they might spend somewhere around $2.4 million. You can estimate what they might spend on future litigations simply by taking a look backwards at the prior litigations. In the end, Watson and Endo actually formed a royalty agreement. So rather than going all the way through with litigation, they settled. And likewise, were you to be in a licensing discussion with either Watson or Endo over a generic entry prior to patent expiration, you can see that historically both these companies have agreed to 25% on the licensing and licensee side, 25% commissions or royalties rather. And so once again, if you're involved in a negotiation with one of these companies, you can tell them you've agreed to 25% in the past. I imagine you may want to do it again. If you want to get into a negotiation with a different company, you can at least cite this as an example. And all of this is coming up in litigation. The other thing you can see is even how much money Endo made, Watson rather made, well, both really. Endo earned $100 million in royalties over a 2-year period, which implies that Watson's criteria for entering the generic market is $200 million a year or lower. So you get a sense for what sort of opportunities Watson is looking for but also how much was made from this deal. So it helps you map out the space around these strategies, and it doesn't cost you a dime. You just have to dig through litigation and see what others have done. And so with that, I'll close. I'm happy to take questions. I have a book, Make Better Decisions. It's $10 as a PDF, dirt cheap. You can also buy it in print. So that's something you might want to look at. These stories and others are covered in there. And I'll close and see the rest of my time for questions. Thank you so much.